administration's infrastructure bill. We're mostly aware of this, that there was $65 billion of federal infrastructure funds that will be delivered to states like Ohio. And so I know that I'm personally interested in understanding much more about the bill, especially coming from an aging city like the city of Cleveland. You know, we have many needs, and I suspect other municipalities in Ohio may share similar needs, including the challenge of aging infrastructure along our roadways, for rail, bulkheads on waterways, bridges, sewers. And like many other municipalities, we also have goals for active transportation and accessing different modes, whether it's through biking, waterways, rail, for everyday commuting and recreation. And the last thing I'll share is that, you know, large infrastructure projects are always on our minds, you know, ones that improve economic development potential and improve upon our assets like our lakefront in Cleveland's case, and large green space projects. I know for us, one thing that we're also going to be thinking about through this is how do we deal with some of the historic and racially inequitable urban renewal infrastructure projects like highways that have also cut through many of our communities. And so hopefully that'll just set the stage for things that we're interested in, Keith, and understanding more about the infrastructure bill. With that, I'm going to go ahead and introduce him. So Keith serves, and I may need to pull up my bio here. Give me 1 second. Keith serves as the Associate Administrator for Highway Policy and External Affairs for the Federal Highway Administration at the U.S. Department of Transportation. He serves to advance the mission and goals of the FHWA while working with all transportation stakeholders, including members of Congress, state agencies, local communities, and other mobility users. He leads the Office of Policy and Governmental Affairs, which is responsible for a variety of critical and diverse topics, ranging from managing congressional affairs, you know, housing the traffic and transportation performance data, collaborating with international community members on new highway technology, et cetera. Prior to his service, which was, he was sworn in on August 30th, 2021, he served as the Department of Traffic and Transportation for the city of Charleston, South Carolina. And prior to that, he was also part of the Safe Routes to School initiative. He is a graduate of Swarthmore College, a former fellow of both the American Council of Young Political Leaders, and is a part of the National Association of City Transportation Officials in their leadership program. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to you, Keith, for your remarks, which will be followed by a question and answer session. So if you do have questions along the way, please feel free to pop them in the question and answer pop-out found at the bottom of your screen, or you can also plug them into the chat and we'll be following along to see what questions resonate. So with that, go ahead, Keith.
Well, it's still morning here, so good morning. And thank you so much for this invitation to join you all at the second annual Moving Ohio Forward Statewide Sustainable Transportation Conference. Many thanks to the entire planning team and especially to Angie and Joyce for the invitation. The last time I had a chance to talk Ohio and transportation was well over 7 years ago when Safe Routes to School National Partnership hosted its conference there. So I fully acknowledge that I'm way overdue. Today, in my capacity as Associate Administrator of Policy and External Affairs at the Federal Highway Administration, it remains a privilege to be a part of the U.S. Department of Transportation team as we work to really implement leadership around the bipartisan infrastructure law. Having previously served in transportation leadership locally, ensuring that the connections between this law and its applications on the ground result in more equitable, resilient, and safe communities, not just for today, but for years to come, is something that's extremely crucial. And so today I'd like to start my remarks with a local story. In 2019, November of 2019, I got a phone call from a congressional office with one instruction. It told me to check my email. I looked, I paused, I said back to the office, is this official? We had just received an $18.1 million grant through what is now called the Rebuilding American Infrastructure with Sustainability and Equity, or RAISE, to build a bike and pedestrian bridge connecting our most populated area, the city, West Ashley, to the largest regional employer, the medical district. With over 200 support letters, including both US senators, the governor, and the state DOT, this was not just a priority for our city, but our state. If you spoke to our locals, or what we call in Gullah, been years, not come years, translation, been here's and come here's, you would hear decades of stories of hope and advocacy for such a vital mobility connection. And what at the time was the worst city for bike and pedestrian death and injuries, here came this signature project that elevated safety, equity, resilience, and mobility for all. But here's the catch: as our Deputy Administrator Stephanie Polick would say, getting a grant is great, but constructing a project is the goal. We learned very quickly how much was being entrusted to us as a direct grant recipient. The imperativeness of partnership with the state DOT and the advocacy we would find in building a relationship with our Federal Highway Division office. It was the state DOT that convened all of the project delivery staff, including the design build team, along with the Federal Highway Division, to ensure we as a local community were equipped to deliver the project. It was the Federal Highway Division office that met with my project manager and other relevant staff weekly, not only to walk through the pre-grant award approval process, but also triage issues and delays. Without the proactive support and intentional resourcing from the Federal Highway Division and our state DOT, we would have not been successful. This partnership was imperative to deliver a transformative project that would set a tone for mobility in that state for years to come. Why did I spend that amount of time walking through that example? Well, as a former transportation director for a local community and now working back at USDOT with so many colleagues within the administration that have done the same at the local, regional, and state level, there is an unapologetic consciousness we have towards not only the support of local communities in making tribes, neighborhoods, towns, cities, and counties more accessible for all, but also the impact of partnership. If the passage and the president's assigning of the bill infrastructure legislation last November possess some overall themes, one definitely has to be that we are in this together. The bill provides an unprecedented opportunity for cities, towns, and other local public agencies to do some great work. USDOT and Federal Highway are committed to supporting you in accessing these infrastructure funds and are actively identifying ways we can help you, especially in smaller and rural communities, build the technical capacity to plan, apply for, and implement projects. As Secretary Buttigieg has previously stated, our focus as an agency, as a department, is to figure out how we are going to deliver the maximum amount of value. Value in crashes that no longer take place because we've used these resources to improve safety. Value by enabling economic growth. Value in protecting people against climate change. Delivering a more equitable transportation system and embracing a new innovative strategies and technologies and mobility for all. We fully acknowledge that we don't have all the answers in Washington, and that some of the best projects and ideas and examples and approaches are going to come from local governments and communities that you work with every day. That's why today's convening is so important. Federal Highway will play a crucial role in implementing these transformational pieces of the legislation. Of the billions in new federal infrastructure investments over the next 5 years provided for surface transportation programs, Federal Highway will administer or support the administration of over $350 billion. In distribution of those critical resources, it's our aim as an agency to do the following: to improve the safety, condition, and performance of our roads and bridges with a focus on climate change mitigation, resiliency, equity, and safety for all users, including vulnerable road users such as cyclists and pedestrians. Build a national network of 500,000 EV chargers by 2030, including a national highway system network that will address EV purchasers' range anxiety and increase the EV market penetration. Make our infrastructure more resilient in the face of increasingly severe floods, wildfires, hurricanes, and other risks. Reconnect communities once divided by transportation infrastructure. Enhance mobility and safety for tribal lands and federal lands, and prepare the workforce for the future and ensure that our workforce is diverse and inclusive. Part of being able to deliver on this legislation is setting a foundation of complementary policies that ensure implementation does not just repeat the mistakes of the past, instead looks forward to build infrastructure today and establishing a bench of projects for the future that our grandchildren can be proud of. Within his first weeks in office, President Biden established the Justice 40 initiative through executive order tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad, with the aim to deliver at least 40% of the benefits of key federal investments to disadvantaged communities. It drives critical thinking to decode disadvantage and redefine our understanding of the benefits and outcomes of transportation programs, such as enhanced jobs and access to opportunity, not simply the amount of funding allocated to a community. In January, the Secretary announced the National Roadway Safety Strategy, a comprehensive plan in partnership with Federal Highway Administration, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, and the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration to significantly reduce injuries and deaths on America's roadways and commit as a department to make zero deaths our goal. In March, Federal Highway released a report to Congress detailing the agency's commitment to advance widespread implementation of the Complete Streets design model and identified Complete Streets as a default approach for funding and designing the majority of federally funded roadways. At the beginning of this month, USDOT released an equity action plan, a critical step to institutionalizing equity across the department's policies and programs with the aim of reducing inequities across our transportation systems and the communities they affect. The objectives and strategies laid out in this document will help support and engage people with communities to promote safe, affordable, accessible, and multimodal access to opportunities and services while reducing transportation-related disparities, adverse community impacts, and health effects. And just this week, in honor of Earth Day, we will roll out several resources to assist local communities in being able to navigate bill, including a toolkit for planning and funding rural electric mobility infrastructure, and a partnership with the Federal Transit Administration on joint flex funding to educate communities about utilizing flex funding for transit and encouraging public transportation projects that reduce single occupancy vehicle travel and associated air pollution on congested highways. So with that baseline regarding the bipartisan infrastructure law, as well as the additional efforts as a department and agency, we have tried to weave together since enactment last fall. We hope that you can see the net we're expeditiously creating to capture communities that for so long have been looking for their opportunity to make change on their streets. With that understanding, I want to leave you with 4 notes for consideration as you join the implementation of this historic law and funding. The first is to take advantage of Federal Highways technical assistance opportunities and state division offices as a resource. Yes, the bipartisan infrastructure law is a transformational, once-in-a-generation piece of legislation with historic amount of funding. But we at Federal Highway don't want the enormity of this opportunity to seem so out of reach for any community. That's why we're leaning in on providing resources and making ourselves as accessible as possible. We've recently announced a newly formed Office of Transportation Workforce Development and Technology Deployment, which will be the Federal Highways conduit to a broad network of external partners, providing world-class subject matter experts, resources, and innovative technologies and practices all under one organization. We've provided pathways for all of our Federal Highway Division offices in every single state and territory to be proactive in supporting, informing, and guiding all eligible entities, including our local governments and organizations. We've created an open docket system where citizens and organizations can submit their perspectives, suggestions, and requests directly to the agency. And we've launched our one-stop shop website where you can learn more about new and existing federal highway programs, as well as how to apply for grants and other discretionary funding opportunities available under the bipartisan infrastructure law. I remember vividly the very first conversation I had with Deputy Administrator Pollack, and she made it very clear that we as an agency would be intentional in making ourselves available to you, building new stakeholder relationships and seeking input at every turn as we design programs to implement bill. 6 months post enactment, we're just getting started and we know we have a great deal of work to do. The second takeaway I wanted to leave you with is that implementation of the bipartisan infrastructure law on the local level is about both discretionary and formula funding. There are many discretionary opportunities for funding that includes expanded eligibilities, but here's the truth. The vast majority of bill funding is by formula. That means dollars being provided to states for both prioritization, distribution, and construction. That being said, formula should not be ignored. Instead, we should encourage cities, counties, MPOs, and tribes to take the both and approach. Find yourselves involved in the decision-making process in partnership with the states, not only because of the funding available, but because the legislation is specific in resources through formula that can benefit localities. And here's some examples for you to consider. The Bridge Formula Program represents the largest U.S. investment in fixing bridges at $27.5 billion over 5 years, which includes $26.5 billion to states and $825 million for tribal transportation facilities. States are required to allocate at least 15% of their formula funds to what we call off-system bridges, or smaller bridges not owned by a state or federal agency, but rather locally owned by a county, town, township, city, municipality, or other local agency. The statute also allows federal funds to be used for 100% of the cost of the eligible bridge projects for these locally or tribally owned off-system bridges. In March, we released our guidance for the transportation alternatives set aside under the Surface Transportation Block Grant, or STBG program, with an increase of from $850 million in fiscal years 2018 to 2020 to an average amount of $1.4 billion from 2022 to 2026. This advances projects that improve safety and accessibility for all users and uses a complete streets approach to create safe, connected, and equitable streets and trail networks. And just this morning, Federal Highway announced the carbon reduction program that unlocks $6.4 billion for states and localities over 5 years in new formula funding. This program will help in the development of carbon reduction strategies and fund a wide range of projects designed to reduce carbon dioxide emissions from on-road highway sources, from installing infrastructure to support electrification of freight vehicles, to personal cars, to constructing bus rapid transit corridors, to facilitating micromobility and biking. For Ohio alone, that's over $214 million over the next 5 years. To put it plainly, there's no reason to limit what funds you go after. The Federal Highway will be there to support your success. Another nugget, if you are taking notes at this time, is to not ignore the planning grant opportunities. Being ready to construct a project is not a prerequisite to take advantage of this funding. Federal Highway and USDOT overall is focused on ensuring that there is a steady pipeline of good projects ready to take advantage of Bill's many funding opportunities. Ohio just saw this with the 2021 RAISE grant of $950,000 towards the Cleveland Bicycle and Pedestrian Trail, an effort to complete construction, planning, and preliminary engineering as a part of the countywide active transportation plan in the region. There are many communities that see there are issues to address, but do not know where to start, or they're sitting on a plan that they just need resources to actually move forward. We as an agency recognize that we need to help recipients plan for these projects, and Bill includes many opportunities, and here are two for you to consider. The Reconnecting Communities Pilot Program is a discretionary grant program funded at a total of $1 billion over the next 5 years, and $250 million of it, or $50 million per year, is dedicated to planning grants. This program presents the opportunity to restore community connectivity by removing, retrofitting, or mitigating highways, railways, or other transportation infrastructure that creates barriers to community connectivity, including to mobility, access, and economic development. Within the program, planning grants can be made for up to $2 million with eligible recipients that include states, NPOs, locals, and tribal governments, and nonprofit organizations. Another grant program we hope to see available for applications in May is the Safe Streets for All program that provides $5 billion over the next 5 years to support local initiatives to prevent transportation-related death and serious injury on our roadways. Of those funds, 40% by statute are reserved for NPOs, local governments, and tribal governments to fund planning, design, and development opportunities for infrastructure projects that reduce or eliminate transportation-related fatalities and serious injuries involving pedestrians, cyclists, public transportation users, motorists, and commercial vehicle operators. The final note of the 4 I promised is that for Federal Highway and the department overall, success of the bipartisan infrastructure law includes elevating best practices in hiring and procurement through the lens of equity. As an agency, we understand that a diverse workforce stimulates innovation, new approaches, and fresh perspectives that help us solve the complex transportation challenges facing our nation. Federal Highway believes enhancing workforce development opportunities, contracting initiatives, and training opportunities is a key part of those efforts. This includes changes to our local hiring practices. Thankfully, the bipartisan infrastructure law authorizes state and local agencies to implement a local and other geographical or economic hiring preference for labor on construction projects funded by federal formula funds or discretionary grants. Historically, it has been difficult to apply local or geographical or economic hiring preferences to projects using federal aid highway funds. But we know that it's not just about getting a project done. It's also about the community being economically a part of that benefit. That benefit extends to additional funding within the bill for disadvantaged business enterprises. In March, Federal Highway announced $10 million in funding from the fiscal year 2021 DBE program to help eligible small businesses compete for federal highway contracts in 45 states, as well as Washington, D.C., Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. Federal Highway, also in partnership with the department, is developing training materials and tools for recipients to use to assist in implementing their DBE programs uniformly. These will be of critical importance when USDOT advertises the many grant opportunities associated with bill. An upcoming notice of proposed rulemaking will ask for the public, and we welcome for your voice in the process, to comment on updates to numerous aspects of the DBE regulations, as we want to make sure equity is in full focus. We encourage DBEs, especially minority and women-owned firms, to become familiar with how to do business with their states, update their business plans to market their businesses to prime contractors, become familiar with upcoming grant opportunities, and consider diversifying their business to be more competitive. So for those who are already emailing or texting your colleague about how you can maximize the bipartisan infrastructure law for your community, let me repeat the 4 notes for you. 1, take full advantage of Federal Highway's technical assistance opportunities and state division offices as a resource. 2, implementation of the bill infrastructure law on the local level is both about discretionary and formula funding. 3, don't ignore the planning grant opportunities. And 4, and finally, success of the bipartisan infrastructure law includes elevating best practices in hiring and procurement through the lens of equity. One thing I failed to mention in my story earlier about my experience receiving federal funds to help bring a major project to the community I served was this one unnamed person who was a constant reminder to me of why we do this work in the first place. When we first applied for the grant and were neck deep in preparing our application, I volunteered to walk out to the very busy road where we wanted the project to begin to grab some pictures for our submission. After traversing through a variation of incomplete sidewalks and desired lines, I reached one of the merged medians and stood there as cars zoomed past. Unbeknownst to me, a young man in his chef uniform holding his lunch in a wrapped plastic bag gingerly walked by me. I snapped a photo of him and watched him navigate a roadway that did not safely accommodate him, but he obviously had crisscrossed many times before. Every time I think about the federal grant we received and the project now being pursued, I think about that man. I think about his safety. Now with the opportunity here at Federal Highway to support communities all around the country and here in Ohio, cannot help think about the people you serve every single day and projects, planning, and engagements this legislation can fund that will be transformational to the safety, equity, and resiliency of those who need it the most. Thank you so much for the opportunity to join you all today, and I look forward to answering some of your questions.
All right, thank you, Keith. Here's my virtual round of applause for you, and thank you for your remarks, and also for summarizing your pointers at the end so that we can really capture all that you had to share today. I know for me, I'm personally very excited to continuously hear about this, the reconnecting communities efforts as well as the safe streets. Those are always on our mind, and I'm certainly excited to hear that there will be more resources directed towards that. So with that, I want to jump into some questions that have started to populate our question and answer. A lot of them are around evaluation. So I want to start with one that discusses how transportation planning has existed in the past. So it's played a key role in maintaining or exacerbating structural racism. How will FHWA require communities to prioritize racial equity in the funding projects? Will there be like a specific method of evaluation around, around that and the benefit cost? So that's the first question. Let's start there, and I'll follow up with an additional one.
Yeah, I think I want to make a delineation between the NOFA process and the guidance process, both of which I think are very important. And I know on a local level, there's such a zooming in on the discretionary aspect, but I think it's also imperative that our mantras around equity, resiliency, and safety showcase themselves very much in our guidance, just as within our NOFOs. Just recently, Office of the Secretary released something a little bit innovative, almost a common application for our mega projects, infra projects, and rural projects. And if you look at the eligibility within those NOFOs, it was very explicit about racial equity as one of the measurables within the qualifiers, both for cost benefit analysis and the ratings of those programs. And so the Secretary has been adamant about making sure that that's the case. We just recently, as I mentioned, came out with our equity action plan, and there's a lot of pieces in there that encourage us through our programs that we're facing there. On the guidance side, we've been very intentional about standardized language within our guidance that elevates various different issues we know are important to this administration and important to those we work with locally on a regular basis. And so even if you look within the carbon reduction program that we released on this morning, you'll see a standardized language in there that's very explicit about our beliefs on safety, on complete streets, on equity, on ADA, on resiliency, on workforce, and otherwise. We want to make sure that as these programs are moved forward, that we're building a bench of programs that aren't repeating things of the past, but looking forward to aspects that we could be proud of.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And actually on that note, as you had mentioned, there was like a slew of various factors that would be considered. There was a specific question about prioritizing projects near stable, affordable housing to prevent displacement as improvements and walkability and other infrastructure elements. We often talk about how these types of infrastructure improvements that promote active transportation can lead to higher market value of housing and sort of more luxury housing. So can you comment on that in terms of how that might be considered, the affordable housing aspect?
I think I understand the question, but if I don't answer it properly, let me
try one more time. Has there been any thought given to prioritizing projects near stable, affordable housing?
I think we have to be thoughtful about that because of who we're serving. I mean, one of the reasons why Deputy Administrator Pollack and Administrator Nuria Fernandez of the Federal Transit Administration came together and asked us as staff to be more intentional about speaking on how federal highway dollars can be flexed for transit, was trying to think more holistically about how we can maximize dollars, especially in the areas that need it the most, right? It doesn't make sense to be investing in transit, especially for those who are dependent on that mode and they can't actually get there, right? And so how do we make sure that those who are getting access to these funds are very clear about how they can maximize as much as possible? And then how are we explicit within both our eligibilities and our guidance that that's allowable? Because I worked on the local level, you learn quickly that if it's not explicitly stated, it's debatable. And so trying to make sure that here in Washington, that we're responsive to the fact that because eligibilities around bill has expanded so much to include local communities, we need to be as clear as possible about how these dollars can be used and maximized as much as possible. I think the other piece of it is the equity action plan that we came out with, every single federal agency had to do their own due diligence of, and it encouraged collaborative efforts with that. And so there's been a number of different ways in which we've been working with HUD about how we navigate transportation with affordable housing. There's been a whole heap of conversations with EPA, and then obviously because of the statute stipulation around the building out of the joint office between USDOT and the Department of Energy, there's a lot of collaboration there too.
That's awesome. It's always great to hear about collaborative efforts and how these efforts are going to be cross-cutting departments, because as we know all of these systems work together, and we all need everyone to be on the same page to work towards equity. One question came in about how, is FHWA willing to provide flex funding directly to cities and MPOs with state DOTs whose values that aren't aligned with FHWA on climate, transit, and road safety. So I think the question is really trying to get at the heart of, what if the state DOT isn't necessarily aligned with your values that you're promoting?
But I think that's why I was explicit about what in formula, just a couple of examples of what specifically is in formula that is by statute that the state has to do in regards to locals. It's not a suggestion that at least 15% of bridge formula funding go to off-system bridges. That's by statute. That's not negotiable. Obviously, we love, if states are able to do more than that, but by statute, they have to do at least 15%. The Transportation Alternatives Program previously, a state could make a transfer out of that program immediately. It's in statute that there needs to be a competitive process for those funds, and that the ability to transfer is by the signature of the secretary, right? So we want that money spent with the localities for the intentions of that program. Even the transferability that's in the carbon reduction program, our preference is for those dollars to be appropriately spent on carbon reduction programs, both at the state and local level. And so we've been intentional about that within our guidance. We've been intentional about that in our conversations with our divisions. And let me just take a 2 seconds on that, because as a local, this was something that was interesting to see locally and then have to emphasize at the Fed level. We understand that our divisions historically have been a conduit with our state DOTs, and that relationship is extremely important. But because the bill legislation expands who's eligible for these dollars, we've made it very clear with our division offices that their doors should be wide open to all eligible entities. And I really encourage, I know even where I work, that it was uncommon to have regular dialogue, conversations, partnerships with Federal Highway Division offices. Our deputy administrator has made it clear that that is a space that localities should feel free to connect with, partner with, use resources from, to be able to effectively navigate the ways that they need to, both on the discretionary and formula side.
So it could range anywhere from the state DOT to the MPO to right down to the municipality. So
and all those programs are very specific, right?
Yeah.
So to be able to execute the carbon reduction program, the MPOs actually have to be involved. There's some communities and where the MPO is trusted with, for example, transportation alternative dollars. I came from a community that was the case. So I think that piece is definitely something that we're being intentional about.
While we're on the topic of regional governments, there was a question that's inviting guidance from FHWA and USDOT to speak to our regional governments and the Ohio DOT while planning our 2-state bridge project. How can we invite that kind of guidance?
Phil, welcome you reaching out to our division office to be duly involved in the process. So like I said, this has been a message that Stephanie, our deputy administrator, has been extremely vocal about, to have their involvement there. And obviously, if there's ways in which we in Washington need to elevate, we will do so. But our DAs, our division administrators, have been great about moving in this new direction.
That's fantastic. I think that type of personal touch, as well as that technical assistance. I believe Angie commented before that, for cities like Cleveland, which is, struggles with, I think that technical capacity is going to be really critical, and that the personal touch to help us work through exactly how to fund projects is going to be key. There was a question regarding the Reconnecting Community program, and will that only be a planning grant, or will there be funds for implementation?
Yeah, there is funding for implementation as well. Projects as low as $5 million. So they have to be $5 million or above in projects. I just wanted to emphasize the planning aspect of it, because there's so many people who see there's a problem over there and we want to address it, right? I came from a community where we had a rail bed that started at the top of our community all the way to the bottom. And the city actually bought that parcel of land and literally divided our entire community. And there, we had an opportunity to think through things. But a big part of it was planning. Like, what exactly should we do here? What are the environmental concerns that we don't even know about? What's possible, what's feasible, what's happened in other communities. So yes, there are capital construction opportunities within that program, but I fully recognize that there's some communities that are starting at -1. They just see that there's an issue to address and don't know where to move. And I think also because we've introduced a piece of legislation that it's massive and there's all this money, it's easy for a local community, a small community, a rural community to say, hey, that's not for us, that's for the big dogs. And I think one of the entry points, and we're trying to lower as much as possible the barrier of entry, is, hey, you might just need a jump start on the planning side to figure out what you do next, and maybe that elevates some potential projects for the future.
Great, thank you. There was a comment earlier in the discussion around advocacy and asking people to call or write their elected officials, asking them to support various programs like Healthy Streets program. Do you have any pointers for those of us who are advocates, and how should we direct our attention and how should we direct our efforts?
So as a former advocate, I think, I guess you can't be former, you're always one, but like, I do think there is a need to continue to make sure that the issues that we're dealing with on a daily basis are elevated. But I will say that the best way for us to advocate is to show proof of concept. We need to show that we at the local level know the projects that are going to help our community move forward, know what's going to work from an equity and resiliency perspective, and showcase that. How do we begin to really build a bench of these projects? Because this is a 5-year authorization. We'll be back here in 5 years for new funding and otherwise. How do we show proof of concept? And what ways can we at the federal level be as much of a help as possible to show that as well? Like we want to show success, not just that. That's why I used that emphasis earlier. Like, we were so excited about getting the grant money, but like, the ultimate success is projects. The ultimate success is seeing the work on the ground. The ultimate success is people not being killed at that intersection, right? Like, that's the ultimate aspect of success. And I think that piece, I hope we lean into that, right? That here is these opportunities for us to take advantage of. Here are these opportunities to use our power of convening to bring the right folk together. I remember I was talking to a county official who's planning to bring together a number of his smaller communities for one particular grant, so that there wasn't 20 different requests, but saying, how can we coordinate together to emphasize that this matters to us as from a regional perspective. And we encourage that. There's some communities who are like, we want to layer funding, so we're going to go for this particular piece of funding here. We're also going to go for this particular funding here because we know all of it working together will make sense. There's some communities who have said, look, we're still trying to figure it out. And so if we can get this $8 million in planning, that will help jumpstart us so that in year 2, year 3, we're ready to move forward with the project. Proof of concept, I think, will be the biggest level of advocacy that these issues matter and should be prioritized.
That's great and really powerful and timely, I think, for us, particularly here in Cleveland. Regarding proof of concept, is it more about getting the project going and in the ground and constructed? Are there evaluation metrics that we should be looking out for that would, support that proof of concept?
Yeah, and I think that's always the case in terms of safety, in terms of use. But I also, and that's why I threw that piece in about on the hiring and the procurement side too. Like, we don't do the whole of equity if we don't talk about the economic part of it too, right? Who's actually involved in the process? What does it mean where we're building a transformative bike ped bridge or a complete streets project or a bus rapid transit system. And, we've been able to ensure that those who are actually working to build the project are coming from that community, or that we exceeded the aspirational goal of a DBE participation, right? I think it's an all-in process of the measurement of success.
That's great. And actually, I was just in a community meeting yesterday about a roadway project where that came up in the community, right? So as we do work in various communities, specifically, communities that have had been subject to the legacy of racial inequity, one of the great questions that came up from a resident was, who's going to be working on this project? Are people from our community going to be working on this project, or is it going to be people outside our community? So I think thinking about the whole spectrum, as you've stated, is just so critical to continue to build wealth and to promote that value of equity. One more follow-up question about advocates for transit or safe streets. Do you have examples where advocates or, do you know of examples where advocates for transit or safe streets have had success gaining additional access to formula funds?
I wish I could ask a follow-up of what it means by additional access. One of the things that I think is important, especially when more money. The Transportation Alternatives Program, for example, is going from 850 million to 1.4 billion. And we're limiting the ability of transferability, how it gets transferred. I think one of the things that came up as an issue as a local advocate and then, running a transportation department is where priorities for the community weren't reflected on the Transportation Improvement Program priority list or the state transportation improvement priority list. And the bipartisan infrastructure law did not do many changes to that process. And I think it's beyond imperative that if, as an advocate, if there's things that you're seeing in your community that you want to see addressed, especially through this funding, that you make sure that you're coordinating with your MPO or your regional planning organization to ensure that that project or that initiative is included within that scope. Because especially as it describes the formula funding, it puts you at a better percentage chance to in your advocacy to make sure that those pieces are funded as much as possible. And so I definitely think MBOs play a significant role in how we navigate the usage of formula funds. And so if you have that off-system bridge that needs to be repaired, and you also want to make sure that there's bike ped accommodations on it in that repair, check that prioritization list and make sure that first of all, that's the case there. And then use your advocacy to point and say, hey, this has been prioritized through both the Transportation Improvement Program and the State Transportation Improvement Program, and it's an off-system bridge, and 15% of your money should be going to off-system bridges. Where does this stand in terms of that specific work? So I definitely think that there's opportunities to take advantage of, and obviously we want to be a support too, and how those dollars get used.
That's great. So we have our homework cut up for us then, in terms of identifying those streets and projects and bridges.
And some of them might already be, but I just raised that as an issue because then, as an advocate, you're like, you want to limit your barriers as much as possible. And to me, that is one of those low-hanging fruit barriers that comes up. We have this issue, we want it addressed, it's a major issue, we wanted to move forward, and running into the wall of, well, this wasn't prioritized, right? And so I think doing that heat check for your community, for your region, and saying, hey, with our MPO, let me go back to that long-range transportation plan that was just done a year ago and see if that's on there. I remember many a times bringing amendments to our transportation improvement program, right? Even the grant that we received, technically that project wasn't on our transportation improvement program, and I had to bring that to our MPO and get a vote and add that to that list. And so shouldn't be afraid of that process to make sure that the projects that you want to see move forward are prioritized in that fashion.
All right, that's great. Great advice. Angie says, never heard of that. Cool. That's great. So I think amendments, in terms of amendments, and that's new to me too. So I'm curious to see how we might be able to work with our
Yeah,
MPO.
and I don't want to misspeak for your MPOs, but there were many times where there was a change. There was a project that was identified as a priority, whether it was by electeds and advocates alike, and to just make sure that all boxes were checked, especially with federal funds, being able to bring that forward through your MPO, and then obviously through if you the state level as well.
Right. And echoing Angie's comment that it seems like they would be making changes anyway in light of the additional money, which again, this bipartisan infrastructure bill is huge.
Yep.
It's just awesome. All right, well, we are about to wrap, but I think that there is a big question in the room, which is, thinking about the great programs and how do we continue this trend towards, the things that you've talked about, equity, sustainability, et cetera, especially if there's political shifts. So if there is a shift towards Republican control in the House and the Senate in November, how do you imagine we sort of weather all of that?
I have no crystal ball, so I I don't have an answer on that one. I think we are so, at the department, we're so neck deep in trying to get these dollars out, make sure folk know how they can access it. So we haven't been doing the what if scenarios. We know that there is money available that folk can take advantage of. I will say that with the fact that almost 90% of the bill legislation is, at least for federal highways, let me make sure I say that correctly, for federal highways, because we have other agencies, is through the formula process. Those things are apportioned for the 5 years of the reauthorization. So definitely on the formula side, much of that will not change. But we're so zoomed in on trying to make sure we get the appropriate guidance out, get the dollars out on the street, so that folk can get access and be able to utilize that. And that's where we're zoomed on in at this time.
That's great. So it's a call to let's do this and get it done. Show proof of concept and begin to mode shift, really.
Of course.
We got to show proof of concept that mode shift works.
Very much so.
Yes. I do have one more question. They keep coming in.
Okay.
New funding includes, this is more technical, new funding includes a lot of discretionary funding for the DOTs. Any advice on how locals can be involved? Is it through that process of outreach directly with FHLBA? What does that look like?
No, so I just want to be clear there that the vast majority of the new discretionary grant programs includes eligibility for cities, counties, MPOs, and tribes. States may be listed, but they are included in the eligibilities. That means direct grant recipient, right? That the money, federal money, could come directly to you as that entity. Now, I will say, having worked at the local level, you need to make sure that you have the appropriate support and otherwise to be a direct funding grant recipient, right? And I think that's where the partnership aspect comes into play, right? And so I think being mindful of that in your application. But the biggest change within this bill legislation is that eligibilities around discretionary grant programs have expanded, where localities can be direct grant recipients, not through an LPA, directly money from the feds to that said entity. And that's going to be a lift in terms of the technical assistance that we'll have to provide, and how we'll have to make sure that we are as supportive as possible to you all. But it's not that goal is not on the back burner for us as an agency, nor as the department. We're trying to lean in around the technical assistance piece. But just want to make that clear. If I was doing a PowerPoint, we have this chart that kind of shows some of the high profile programs and the fact that the vast majority of them includes eligibilities. And in fact, the Safe Streets for All program, the only entity that's not eligible for that program is the states. The Safe Streets for All program is all to localities, cities, counties, MPOs, tribes, or other local entities, right? So just want to be clear about that.
That's great. Well, thank you for hammering that home. And thank you again for inviting us over and over again to reach out directly with you to discuss further. I echo the comments that we're so lucky to have you at FHWA. Thank you for spending the time with us and just for your perspective, your expertise, your stories, and your service. This has been immensely helpful. I know for me, I'm excited to get going, to do our homework, and to begin really advocating for safer streets and healthy communities and all that. Final thing, is there an email or way to follow up? And is there a website that you would recommend that we follow along for continuous updates?
Yeah, I definitely, like I said, I definitely welcome outreach to our Federal Highway Division office for additional support and questions around bill. We do have a one-stop shop. If you if you just type in Google Federal Highway bill, that whole website will come out there. We update that regularly. On there is also an open docket that we started from the day of enactment, where we welcome in comments, suggestions, information, and otherwise of what's happening within your community. That's on there. I will also say there's a couple of programs that are having some webinars to kind of walk through how to access those programs. One of them that's coming up is the Safe Streets for All. Last week, USDOT launched a website that went into the details of the Safe Streets for All program in anticipation of the NOFO release in the coming weeks. And there's a series of 3 different webinars on various different topics associated with that program that are free, and you're welcome to be able to join there. I just saw somebody post something about technical assistance. Literally at the top of our federal our FHWA bill website, there's a tab for technical assistance, and they'll give you all the various resource centers, ways in which you can engage and otherwise.
Great. Well, with that, we'd like to wrap. Angie, I see you've turned your camera on, so wanted to see if you wanted to have any comments or questions.
I just want to thank you all again, Joyce. It's amazing to have you here. I think people across the state are really excited about the new mayoral administration with Justin Bibb in Cleveland. And I think the city's really in a good place, and it was such an honor to have you here. Keith, thank you so much. Hopefully we can really put this information to use. And next time you come back to Ohio, it'll be a utopia of trains and bikes, you know, you won't recognize it.
Oh, and we have lots of projects. We have lots of projects that we're excited about.
At least Cleveland's, we got under control.
Yeah.
Understood. No, I'm very grateful for the opportunity. You know, it's always level setting to speak about these issues at the local level. It's, you know, having gone local and then coming back, you always get reminded of how much of a bubble DC can be sometimes. And so it's imperative for us to be able to always think about how we are translating what's being asked from us as an agency to how it actually looks locally. And so we appreciate your patience, but also your support and partnership as we try to make this implementation what it's supposed to be.
And Cleveland has really benefited in the past from federal discretionary grants, like the Tiger Grant. We just sort of cut the ribbon on this 48-mile beautiful trail that goes right through past our downtown, through right past our steel mills, all the way down to Akron. So we really have benefited a lot, and there's a lot more opportunity, I think, with what's coming down the line now. So just thank you so much again. And this is just a housekeeping item. We're going to take a little break. Our next panel at 1 is very sort of, it really will feed nicely. This panel will feed nicely into it. We're going to be talking about the potential of Amtrak expansion in Ohio, which is a very live issue politically right now, and 3C rail, which is something that's been discussed for a long time and we came really close to achieving in the past. So we have a great panel to discuss that. We're going to take a little break, so get some lunch, get some coffee, and we'll be back at 1. And thanks again to you two.
Thanks, Angie. Thanks, Keith.
Thank you.
See you around.